Day 9, and the cold came up through her knees like a current. Maggie Halloran knelt in the snow behind Crestline Lodge with the blue sky hard and bright over the pines, and for the 9th morning running, she watched her dog dig at a place that had no reason to matter. Bruno had thrown himself at the same wind-packed snowbank against the north foundation, paws flinging white over his shoulders, that great red and white chest heaving, a low whine coming out of him that she felt more than heard. She called his name. He didn't even flick an ear. 150 pounds of stubborn St. Bernard with his nose buried in the bank, and the rest of the mountain, the whole bright sweep of Mount Solace, might as well not have existed. "Bruno," she said again, and reached for his collar. Her mittens were soaked through and useless. She peeled the right one off to get a real grip, and that was when her bare fingers, fishing past the dog's working paws into the snow he'd cleared, struck something that was not stone and was not ice. It was flat. It was smooth in the way that only worked wood is smooth. And there, under her cold-numbed thumb, was a seam, and then a shape she knew the instant she touched it, the way you know a face in the dark, a hinge, iron and old, frozen stiff. Below it, a hand-forged latch. Maggie went very still. The dog stopped too. He backed off the bank, sat down in the snow he'd thrown, and looked at her, not panting, not whining now, just watching her with those soulful brown eyes, steady and certain, as if to say, at long last, finally. She knelt there with her bare hand against the buried timber and her breath smoking in front of her face, and she understood that everything Daniel Croy had told her about this place was wrong. She had bought Crestline Lodge 2 months earlier, in April, for almost nothing. That was the kind of thing a person could do when grief had hollowed out the middle of her life and left her rattling around inside it. 2 years a widow. Tom gone, Tom, her husband of 34 years, a structural engineer with reading glasses always pushed up into his hair, who had taught her to look at a building the way he did. Where the weight goes, where a wall is telling the truth, and where it's lying about what's behind it. Maggie had been a schoolteacher in Denver for most of her life. 4th grade, patient and warm and practical. And when Tom died, the house they'd shared had gone so quiet she could hear the refrigerator from any room in it. So when the county tax sale listing came across her screen one sleepless night, a shuttered 1930s timber ski lodge on a mountain she'd never heard of, dark for half a century, priced like an apology, she had not thought it through the way Tom would have wanted. She had simply driven up into the high country to look at it, and the moment she stood in the snow in front of that long timber frame building with its steep roof and its dark windows and its silence so much bigger than the silence in Denver, she had wanted it. Not for profit, not for any sensible reason at all. She wanted somewhere big enough to put the grief down. Daniel Croy, the county clerk who doubled as the only realtor in 3 valleys, had been friendly and frank with her over the paperwork. 38, a wedding ring, a pickup so caked with spring mud you couldn't read the colour. He'd liked her, she could tell, and he'd done his honest best to talk her out of it. "I'm not supposed to discourage a sale," he'd said, sliding the deed across the diner table, "but Mrs. Halloran, you should know what you're getting. That place has been dark since the 70s. The old ski patrol building burned down some time back. There's just a foundation line left of it, off in the trees. And the lodge itself got picked clean decades ago. Hunters, kids, scavengers, there's nothing in it but mice and old memories. You're buying a view and a lot of roof to keep up." "That's all right," Maggie had said. "I have a lot of time to keep things up now." He'd looked at her then with something kinder than skepticism, and he'd let it go. She'd brought Bruno up with her when she moved in for the summer, because there was nobody to leave him with, and because the lodge was the first place she'd lived that was big enough not to make a dog like Bruno feel like a piece of furniture in the way. Nobody had wanted Bruno. That was the plain truth of him. He was a rescue, roughly 4 years old, classic markings, a heavy jaw and a barrel chest and a snore you could hear through 2 doors. He had washed out of an avalanche rescue program over in the next county, and the word they'd used on his paperwork was fixates. He locked onto one scent, one idea, one spot, and after that, you could shout yourself hoarse, and he would not be moved. In a rescue dog, they told her that was a disqualifying flaw. A dog had to take direction, had to break off and go where the handler sent him. Bruno wouldn't. Bruno decided what mattered and gave the rest of the world the back of his big head. They'd called him a failure. They'd been ready to keep calling him that until something gave way. Maggie had driven over and taken him home the day she heard, because she knew a little something herself, just then, about being a creature that the practical world had quietly decided it was finished with. She and the washout had understood each other from the first. From the very first day at Crestline, Bruno ignored the lodge. He ignored the front porch and the great stone hearth and the long dim hall of rooms with their sheeted shapes. He ignored the meadow and the tree line and the burned-out scar where the patrol building had stood. There was exactly one thing on the whole property that interested him, and it was a smooth, blameless bank of old snow against the north stone foundation behind the kitchen wing, snow that lay there stubborn and grey-blue in the shadow of the building long after the rest of the south-facing slopes had gone to mud and green. He dug at it the first afternoon. Maggie hauled him off, thinking pipe, propane tank, some poor frozen marmot. He went back the next morning. She hauled him off again. By the end of the first week, she'd stopped being annoyed and started being unsettled, because there is something in the steadiness of an animal that gets under your reasoning. He didn't dig anywhere else. He didn't dig the way a bored dog digs, in bursts, then wandering off after a smell. He went to the same spot, at the same hour, the cold blue hour just after dawn, and he worked it like a job. He's decided that's his, she told Daniel, when he came up in May with a form she'd had to sign. They stood watching the dog flinging snow. Daniel laughed, not unkindly. Bernards are like that. Mine had a corner of the yard he was convinced had a badger in it for 9 years. Never was a badger. He squinted at the foundation. Probably an old drain. Place is full of dead pipe, maybe, but Maggie had spent 34 years married to a man who taught her to read a building, and the more she looked at that stretch of the rear wall, the less she liked what it was telling her. The foundation along the north side was fieldstone, laid in courses by some careful hand in the 30s, and it ran true and even the whole length of the kitchen wing, except in the one place Bruno had claimed. There the stonework was wrong. Thicker, the courses didn't line up with their neighbours. They broke and restarted, the mortar a different colour, greyer and coarser, as though a section of wall had been filled in at a different time, by a different person, in a hurry. It didn't read like built. It read like closed, like a doorway that someone had walled over and meant you not to notice. Where a wall lies about what's behind it, Tom said, in the back of her mind, dry and patient. Go on, Maggie, you know how to do this. Measure it. So she did. She felt foolish doing it, a 61-year-old woman pacing off her own kitchen with a tape measure and a stub of pencil. But she did it carefully, the way he'd have done it. She measured the pantry, the deep, cold, north-facing pantry off the back of the kitchen with its empty shelves and its smell of old flour and stone. She wrote down the length of the inside wall. Then she went out into the snow and measured the outside of the foundation, hand over hand along the cold fieldstone, from the corner of the building to the chimney masts. The numbers didn't agree. They didn't agree by a wide margin, better than 6 feet of it. 6 feet of length that existed on the outside of that wall and simply was not there on the inside. Between the back of her pantry shelves and the outer face of the foundation there was a space, sealed up and unaccounted for, exactly the size of a small room, and it sat directly behind the patch of bad stonework. And the Snowbank Bruno wouldn't leave alone lay against the outside of it like a hand laid over a mouth. She stood in the pantry a long time after that, with her flashlight on the back wall, and the quiet of the lodge pressed in around her, and for the first time it didn't feel empty. It felt held. She started asking, after that, down in the valley town. Pinnacle Hollow was a single street of a place, a diner, a hardware store, a gas station, a church, all of it tucked in the cold blue shadow of the mountain. Maggie was good with old people, she'd taught their grandchildren, and she knew how to sit with a cup of coffee and let a conversation come to her instead of chasing it. So she sat at the diner counter and mentioned, easy as anything, that she'd bought the old lodge up on Mount Solace. Crestline, and she watched the name do something to the room. It was small, but she caught it, the way the man 2 stools down stopped buttering his toast, the way the waitress's smile went a degree more careful, the way an old fellow in a window booth turned his face to the glass. Crestline. Like a cold draught had come in under the door. Pretty up there, the waitress said, recovering, refilling a cup nobody had asked her to refill. Long time empty, though. At the hardware store it was the same. She bought a trowel and a pry bar and a box of long screws, and she said where she was living and the owner. A heavy-set man with kind eyes who'd been perfectly chatty about the weather went quiet and busy with the register. "You bought the lodge," he said, not quite a question. "I did." He nodded slowly. He seemed to be deciding something, and then to decide against it. "Well," he said, "mind the road in winter. It drifts bad on the north side." He handed her the bag. And then, almost to himself, as he turned away, that was a bad spring up there, a long time ago. The patrol. He shook his head once, like a man waving off a fly. Long time ago. She tried to ask him what he meant, but the door had already shut behind whatever he'd been about to say. Piece by piece, over a few weeks of cups of coffee and careful patience, she gathered the shape of it without ever getting the heart. There had been, once, a ski patrol on Mount Solace, a real one, volunteers, men from the valley who knew the snow. Back in the 50s and into the 60s, Crestline had been a working ski lodge, and these men had done genuine rescues up in the bowls and the chutes, pulling people out of slides, off the mountain, alive. They'd been admired. There had been dogs, somebody said, big rescue dogs, bred right there on the mountain. And then, something had happened. Some bad spring, somebody always said, lowering their voice, the bad spring, and after it the mountain had closed to skiing for years and years, and the patrol was gone, and nobody, not one soul over 60 in that whole valley, would tell a stranger in a red coat how the story ended. The patrol. The words stenciled in her mind now, sitting up there in her cold pantry behind 6 unaccounted feet of stone. She thought of Bruno, big rescue dogs, bred right there on the mountain. She looked at her washout, snoring by the cold hearth with his heavy head on his paws, the dog who fixated, the dog the modern world had handed back, and a strange feeling moved through her that she didn't have a name for yet. And then it was day 9, and her bare fingers were on a frozen latch. She didn't let herself think. She went back inside through the kitchen door, her heart going hard, and she came out with the new trowel and an old garden spade she'd found in the woodshed and the pry bar still wrapped in its store paper. And she knelt back down in the snow beside her dog, and she dug. Bruno dug with her. The two of them, the woman and the failure, throwing snow in the bright cold morning while the blue sky went on overhead like a held note. The snow gave way to a crust of ice along the foundation, and she chipped at it with the edge of the trowel, working down, and the more she cleared, the more there was to see. And what there was to see stopped the breath in her throat. A door, a low door, set into the foundation itself, no taller than her shoulder, a heavy thing of vertical planks bound with iron straps gone black with age. The whole of it sunk below the old grade, so that snow and seasons had long since swallowed it. The hinges she'd felt, the hand-forged latch. And across the planks, under 60-odd years of frost and grime, the ghost of paint, a faded red cross. And beneath it, stenciled in letters she had to lean close and brush clean with her bare thumb to read. Patrol. Maggie sat back on her heels in the snow. Her hands were shaking, and it wasn't the cold. Bruno pressed himself against her side, all that great warm weight of him leaning into her, and she felt that he was trembling too. Not with fear, she thought, but with something nearer to relief, the whole body shudder of a creature finally believed. She put her bare hand flat against the buried door. The iron of the latch was so cold it burned. Picked clean, Daniel had said. Nothing but mice and memories. But this door had not been opened in a very long time. She knew it the way she knew a wall that was lying, and whatever was behind it had been shut away on purpose, by hands that meant it to stay shut, and the snow had kept their secret faithfully for 100 winters. Above her the sky was that hard, perfect, heartbreaking blue, and the pines stood black and still, and the cold smelled of wood smoke and stone. Her fingers found the latch and curled around it. And then she stopped. Whatever this was, whatever the valley had buried under its lowered voices, whatever the bad spring and the patrol had cost the old men who wouldn't finish the story, it was not hers to open alone, kneeling in the snow with no one beside her but a dog who had carried it for 9 days the only way he knew how. Some doors a person had no right to break open by herself. Some doors you owed to whoever was still living, who remembered what was behind them. She took her hand off the latch. She looked down at Bruno, and Bruno looked back at her, steady and sure, and she found she was nodding to him as if he'd asked her a question. "All right," she said softly, her breath smoking in the bright air. "All right. Not alone. We'll find the one who knows." She got to her feet in the deep snow, brushed the ice from Tom's old fingerless gloves, and turned back toward the lodge, and somewhere down in the cold blue valley below her, in a town that had spent 60 years not saying his name, the last man alive who could open that door was sitting with his coffee, not yet knowing that a widow and a washed-out dog had just found their way to the thing he'd never stopped guarding. Day 9, and the latch held its cold shape under her bare fingers like something that did not want to be the last secret it had kept. Maggie did not force it. She knelt in the snow a moment longer, Bruno's heavy flank pressed to her side, both of them breathing hard, and she made herself a small promise out loud, the way Tom used to when a job got bigger than the plan. "Not alone," she said. The dog's ear twitched. She covered the exposed top of the door with a tarp from the kitchen wing, weighted the corners with stones, and drove down the switchbacks to Pinnacle Hollow before her courage could turn into curiosity, and her curiosity into something foolish. Daniel Croy was at the county office with his boots on the desk and a sandwich in his hand, and when she told him what was buried against the north foundation, he stopped chewing. "Picked clean," he said, but it came out uncertain this time, the way a man repeats a thing he was told rather than a thing he knows. She asked him who in the valley had been there when the mountains still ran patrol. He thought about it longer than she expected. Then he set the sandwich down. "There's one," he said. "Gus Pelletier. He won't talk about it." People stopped asking. He gave her the address anyway, a narrow house at the end of Cedar Street with a swept porch and a stack of split wood squared off as neat as a sergeant's bunk. The man who opened the door was lean and upright, 84 and carrying it like 60 white moustache trimmed level. A carved cane hooked over his forearm, though he didn't seem to lean on it. He looked at her red coat and at the truck and waited. "My name's Maggie Halloran," she said. "I bought Crestline Lodge. At the tax sale." His face did not change, but something behind it did, the way still water changes when something moves underneath. "My dog," she went on, "has been digging at the North Foundation. 9 days, the same spot. This morning, I found a door." Gus Pelletier was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked, very low, almost gentle, "A St. Bernard?" She nodded. And he asked the question that turned her cold all the way through, because it was the exact word the Avalanche School had used on the paperwork that sent Bruno home a failure. "Does he fixate?" She said yes. The old man closed his eyes for a second, and when he opened them, he stepped back from the door and said, "You'd better come in." His kitchen was warm and smelled of coffee and pipe tobacco gone cold. He poured her a cup without asking and set it down and lowered himself into the chair across from her, both hands folded on the head of the cane. "We bred those dogs on that mountain," he said. "Right there at Crestline. There was a line of them, going back before my time, big reds with the heavy jaw, and they had a thing in them the trainers today would call a defect." He almost smiled. "They'd lock on to one scent under the snow, and they would not be moved. You could call, you could pull, you could shame them. They'd dig till their pads bled, because they knew something was down there, and you didn't. We didn't fight it. We trusted it. That stubbornness pulled more people out of slides than every probe pole we owned." He looked at her. "Your dog isn't broken, Mrs. Halloran. Your dog is the line. There's no other reason on this earth he'd worry that exact stone." She thought of Bruno snoring by the cold hearth, those first lonely nights, the dog nobody else would take, and she had to look down into her coffee. They went up the next clear morning, the 4 of them, because Daniel insisted on coming and Gus did not object. The sky over Mount Solace was that hard scoured blue that only comes in deep winter, the pines black-green and bowed with snow. The smell of wood smoke from the valley thin and far below them. Bruno went straight to the snowbank as if no night had passed, and stood over the tarp, and looked back at them, plainly impatient with the slowness of people. Gus stood a while before the cleared timber without touching it. He read the faded red cross and the stenciled word patrol, and his jaw worked under the white moustache. "I helped paint that," he said. "I was 19. He laid his palm flat on the planks the way Maggie had seen Tom lay a hand on a beam to feel whether it was sound. This was the cache. Storeroom, we called it. Rope, toboggans, lanterns, the splints, the armbands. And it was Eli's post." He said the name carefully, as though it had weight he'd carried a long way. "Eli Vance. He kept this room. Knew where every coil of rope hung in the dark. He told it then, plainly the way she'd hoped someone finally would, with no relish and no flinching." March of 1962. A hard winter, a season of real rescues, the patrol worn down to leather and nerve. A slide came off the upper bowl in the late afternoon, a big one, and they went out as they always went out. "We got everyone home," Gus said. "Every soul on that mountain that day came down because of us." He paused and the cane head turned slowly under his hands. Except Eli. There was a skier the slide had pushed off the traverse, a stranger separated from her group. Eli went back up for her. He always went back. He got her to a stand of timber where the others reached her. Gus's voice stayed level, but it cost him. He didn't come off the mountain. The weather closed. We searched till there was nothing left to search. Nobody spoke. The wind moved in the high pines with a sound like a long breath let out. We finished the season, Gus said. I don't know how, but we did. And then we came up here, the ones that were left, and we locked this room because it was his, and we couldn't bear to empty it. We laid stone over the door with our own hands and let the snow take it, and we took off the armbands and we didn't put them on again. The patrol ended that spring. The town buried the whole of it because nobody could say his name without. He stopped. Without this, he finished and touched the planks again. I'm the last one. I'm the only one left who knows what's behind this door. He reached into his coat and brought out a ring of old keys, blackened with age, and worked one free of the others with fingers that were not quite steady. I've carried this 60 years, he said, and I never once thought I'd use it. I thought it'd go in a drawer when I went in the ground. He looked at the dog. I surely never thought a St. Bernard would come back and tell us where the door was. The lock had swollen with 6 decades of cold and would not turn. Gus worked it patiently, the way a man works a thing he respects, and still it held. Then Bruno shouldered in and dug at the base of the door, at the last seam of ice packed hard into the threshold, throwing it back in dark wet clods. And when the iron sill was bare, Gus tried the key again, and something deep in the mechanism gave with a sound like a knuckle cracking. The plank door groaned, resisted, and then swung inward on hinges stiff with sleep, and the cold, dry breath of a room that had not been opened in 60 years came out to meet them. It was small and low and utterly still. The light from the doorway fell across a dirt and plank floor, and on it everything sat exactly where Hans had left it in 1962. A coil of rope hung from a peg, the hemp gone pale but whole. A wooden rescue toboggan leaned against the far wall, its leather lashings dry but sound. 2 oil lanterns stood on a shelf, the glass furred with dust, the wicks still in them. And folded on that same shelf, squared away with a care that made Maggie's throat tighten, lay the patrol's armbands. The red crosses faded to the colour of an old barn, but unmistakable, a small neat stack of them, waiting. On a peg by itself hung a St. Bernard's harness, the leather worn soft and dark at the chest, where a great dog had leaned into it pulling, year after year. Gus looked at it a long time. That was his dog's, he said quietly. Eli's dog. She wouldn't come off the mountain either that spring. We never made her. Bruno crossed the small room and put his nose to the harness and stood there, breathing it in, and would not move, and nobody made him. Daniel had gone very still in the doorway, all the scepticism gone out of him. I told you it was empty, he said to no one. Everybody said it was picked clean. They were wrong, Maggie said. And then she saw the wall. The whole of the back wall, floor to low ceiling, was covered in letters. Dozens of them, scores of them, pinned to the planks and stacked on a narrow shelf beneath, some in stiff envelopes gone the brown of weak tea, some just folded pages curled at the corners. All of them written in the careful hands of people who had sat down at kitchen tables to say a thing that mattered. Maggie stepped close, not touching, and read the ones she could. They were addressed to the Mount Solace Patrol. They were addressed, many of them, to Eli Vance by name. They were thank you letters, from skiers the patrol had dug out of the snow and carried down, across years, from people who had gone home alive and sat down later to say so, and they had never been delivered. because the patrol had gathered them up after he died and brought them here and pinned them to his wall and sealed them in with everything else of his, since there was no longer anyone whose job it was to open the mail. We couldn't give them to him, Gus said behind her, and now his voice was not quite level anymore. So, we gave them to the room. Maggie understood, standing in that cold, dry quiet with the blue light at her back and the dog leaning into a dead man's harness, exactly what she had been handed. Not treasure. Daniel had been right about that part. In the only way that mattered, there was nothing in here to sell. What she had found was a debt. A whole valley's worth of gratitude, written down and never paid, walled up for 60 years, because the one man it belonged to most had not come home to receive it. Gus took one letter from the shelf with great care, an envelope soft as cloth, and drew out the page and held it at arm's length to read it in the doorway light. His hand shook. He read it aloud, slowly, and his steady old voice broke once, and he let it, and went on. It was from a girl Eli had carried down off the Traverse in the winter of 1959, a girl of 11 who'd been buried to the shoulders and certain she would die there, who wrote that she still woke some mornings glad of the cold because it reminded her she was alive to feel it, and that she thought of the big quiet man and his big quiet dog every single day, and would he please know that. It was signed with a girl's name and a date, and below it, in different ink, a line added later in an older hand, "I am old now, and I have never forgotten." Maggie did the arithmetic without wanting to. The girl was alive. The girl was an old woman somewhere, and she had written twice, years apart, and never once been answered. There was a logbook on the shelf too, a black-bound ledger soft, with damp gone dry again, and Gus opened it to the last written page. The final entry was in a plain, even hand, unhurried, the hand of a man with no idea it was the last thing he'd set down. It noted the rope inventory, 2 splints wanting repair, and then, almost as an afterthought, a line that he meant to bring the new dog up come spring to start her on the scent work, and that the cachie would want airing once the thaw came, and he'd see to it then. He had been making plans for April. He had fully intended to open this door again himself. Maggie closed the book gently and stood among it all, and she knew already that she would not sell it, and she would not hoard it, and she would not lock it back up. The dog had spent 9 days telling her what to do, and Gus had spent 60 years waiting to be allowed to, and the wall of letters had spent a lifetime waiting to be read by the people who'd written them. The answer was the same answer in all 3. So that was what she did. She turned Crestline's wide front room, the one with the riverstone hearth and the windows that held the whole white shoulder of the mountain, into something between a memorial and a homecoming. The harness went on the wall, and the armbands beside it under glass, and the letters, every one of them, were cleaned and pressed flat and framed in long rows where the morning light could reach them, each one open to be read, the way they were always meant to be. The logbook lay open beneath, turned to that last unfinished page. And through the spring, with Gus steady at her shoulder and Daniel driving the back roads with a list, they went looking for the people whose names were on the envelopes. They found more than Maggie dared hope. They found the girl from 1959, 80 now, in a care home 2 valleys over, who pressed her hand to her mouth when she saw her own child's handwriting under glass. They found sons and daughters of skiers long gone, who had grown up on a story they'd half believed. They found, in the end, enough of them to fill the front room and spill out onto the cleared deck on a high blue sky morning in May, snow still bright in the upper bowl, the pines dripping in the sun. Gus stood up in front of all of them, upright, his cane in one hand, and he said the name out loud the way it deserved to be said, in front of witnesses, in the open air. Eli Vance, and the saying of it did not break him this time. He told them what their letters had been doing for 60 years, and where and why, and he thanked them on behalf of a patrol that was down to one man, and the one man was him. Then he did the thing Maggie would remember longest. He took an armband from the case, the red cross faded soft, and he knelt down stiffly in front of the big red and white dog who had not left her side all morning, and he buckled it onto Bruno's collar with his own unsteady hands. "You're the line," he said, just to the dog, though everyone heard it. "You came back and you told us. You're not a washout. You never were. You're the last of the dogs that saved this mountain, and you did it again." Bruno leaned his great head against the old man's chest, the way he'd leaned into the harness, and held still and let himself be honoured. Maggie watched from the doorway with Tom's old fingerless gloves on her hands, and she thought about how she'd come up this mountain to outrun a silent house, and how the house was not silent anymore. It was full of people reading letters aloud to one another, and weeping a little, and laughing more than that, and a valley was finally, 60 years late, saying thank you. When they'd all gone home, in the long blue evening, she sat by the hearth with a cup of coffee going cool in her hands. Bruno was asleep on the warm stone beneath the wall of letters, the faded armband still on his collar, snoring his deep, contented snore. The north door of the storeroom stood open to the bright, cold air, propped open on purpose now, aired the way Eli had meant to air it that April he never got to. 9 days the dog had dug at one clean snowbank while everyone called it nothing. Behind it had been the patrol's sealed cache of 1962, and a wall of thanks no one had ever delivered, and the answer to a grief that had kept a whole town quiet for a lifetime. The grief that had driven Maggie up Mount Solace was still hers. But it had changed shape on her, the way the snow changes shape and stays snow. It had become a thing she could live inside, a warm room with the light coming in, a sleeping dog, an open door. She finished her coffee and did not go to bed for a long while. There was no hurry now. The mountain had given up what it was keeping, and so, at last, had she.